I've always enjoyed hiking alone. It's one of those things that helps clear my mind, gives me space to think, and disconnect from everything that usually weighs on me. The mountains have a way of reminding you just how small you are compared to everything else. I think that's why I love it so much. When you're alone on the trail, the world becomes simpler. Just you, your thoughts, and nature. That morning, the weather had been perfect. Crisp air and bright sunlight, with just a light breeze. The trail I chose wasn't anything too challenging. An easy 3-hour loop near the outskirts of town. Nothing special, really. I had hiked it a few times before. The path wasn't heavily trafficked, but there was always a couple of hikers here and there, and that's what I liked about it. You didn't feel completely isolated, but it was still far enough out there to give you some peace. I arrived at the trailhead, pulled my backpack from the car, and double-checked my gear. I was used to hiking alone, but there was always a little bit of nervousness, even if it was just for a second. Being out in the woods, miles away from anyone, could make anyone uneasy. As I started down the path, the first few hundred yards were familiar. The wide, well-maintained trail that gradually sloped upwards. The dirt was packed from others passing through, and the trees on either side were thick with leaves. Birds chirped from the branches above, and the sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the ground. I took a deep breath and let the quiet settle in. No phone, no notifications, just the steady rhythm of my boots crunching against the earth. I hadn't even realized how much I needed this, how much I needed to escape the noise of everyday life. It felt like it was going to be a good day. After a few miles, the trail started to narrow and become more rugged. The trees grew thicker, blocking out the sunlight a little more, and the ground underfoot became uneven. I welcomed the change. The solitude of this deeper part of the forest was exactly what I came for. I pushed forward, feeling the burn in my legs from the incline. I wasn't in a hurry. There was no rush. I just wanted to enjoy the hike, enjoy the quiet, and think about everything and nothing all at once. It was about an hour later when I came to a split in the trail. I remembered it from my previous hikes here. The main path veered off to the right, leading toward a lookout point, while a smaller, less maintained trail veered left toward an old creek bed. Normally, I would have taken the main path to the lookout, but for some reason, I felt drawn to the smaller trail this time. Maybe it was the sense of adventure, or maybe it was the need to just get away from the usual route. The trail was overgrown, and the path wasn't as clearly marked, but I liked it that way. It made me feel more connected to the land, like I was discovering something new, something most people didn't see. The first few steps were easy, but the further I went, the more the trail began to fade, until it was barely noticeable at all. I had to push through branches and underbrush, and the ground became rockier, making it harder to move quickly. But I didn't mind, it just added to the feeling of isolation, the feeling that I was truly alone out here. As I moved forward, I started to notice something strange. It wasn't exactly a sound, but a feeling, like I was being watched. I stopped for a moment, scanning the area around me. The forest was quiet, too quiet. There were no birds chirping, no squirrels scurrying through the trees. It felt like the world had gone still. I shook off the feeling. Maybe it was just my imagination, the isolation playing tricks on me. I was alone in the woods, after all. It was only natural to feel a little jumpy. I kept moving, but the unease didn't leave. The trail narrowed further, the underbrush thickening. The trees grew even taller, their branches twisting high above me, creating a canopy so dense that the sunlight barely reached the ground. I felt a shift in the air, like the temperature dropped slightly, and the wind picked up, rustling the leaves. My skin prickled, and then, just as I was about to push forward, I heard it, a rustling from behind me, not the wind. This was deliberate, like something or someone was moving through the trees. I froze, my heart beating a little faster now. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. I turned around, but there was nothing. The trail behind me was empty, the forest still. I stood there for a few moments, my breath shallow, trying to convince myself it was nothing. I was being ridiculous. There was no one else out here. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I'd been on enough hikes to know that the woods can play tricks on you, but this felt different. It wasn't just a passing discomfort. It was a heavy, lingering feeling. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just a deer or some other animal moving through the trees. Or maybe it was the wind playing tricks on the branches. I pushed on, deciding not to let the strange sensation stop me. But the further I went, the worse it got. The feeling of being watched, of someone or something lurking just out of sight, became impossible to ignore. My pace slowed, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I kept telling myself that it was nothing, but deep down, I knew something was off. It wasn't just the quiet or the stillness of the forest. It was the sense that I wasn't truly alone. The trail began to widen again as I reached the creek bed. The sound of rushing water ahead was a relief, a familiar noise that reminded me that this wasn't just some terrifying place in the middle of nowhere. But the comfort it should have provided was fleeting. I looked around, trying to shake the growing dread in my chest. The trees were quieter now, almost too quiet, and the rushing water did nothing to calm the unease. I reached the creek, stepping carefully over the rocks, and paused to look down at the water. The water was clear, running fast and cold over smooth stones. For a moment, I lost myself in the rhythm of the current, listening to it rush by. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again, a figure, a shadow moving between the trees. I snapped my head in that direction, but when I looked, there was nothing, just the trees swaying in the breeze. I was certain I had seen someone, though. They were tall, their shape indistinct but definite. The way they moved was almost unnatural, like they were waiting for me to look away. I couldn't shake the image from my mind. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. My eyes darted back to the trail, to the creek, to every direction I could see. Nothing. I felt my legs start to shake. I had been on plenty of solo hikes before, and I knew the woods could play tricks on you, but this wasn't just paranoia. There was something wrong, something lurking just outside my sight. I didn't waste any more time. My heart was racing now, pounding in my chest, my thoughts scattered and frantic. I had to get out of here. I turned quickly, retracing my steps down the creek, back toward the split in the trail. The woods seemed to close in around me. The trees were taller, their trunks twisted in unnatural ways. The underbrush felt denser, thicker. The air grew colder, almost unnervingly so, and I could feel the sweat on my brow despite the chill. And then, as I reached the point where the trail split again, I froze. The figure was there, standing just ahead of me at the edge of the path, half hidden in the shadows of the trees. The same shape, standing completely still, watching me. I didn't hesitate. My feet moved before my brain could process what I was seeing. I turned, running back the way I had come, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I pushed through the underbrush. My heart was in my throat, couldn't stop. I had to get out of there. I ran and ran, the world blurring around me as I tore through the woods. My mind was racing, my thoughts a jumble of fear and adrenaline. I didn't care if I got lost. I didn't care if I fell. I just needed to get away. The feeling of being followed, of something hot on my heels, was so intense that I didn't even realize when I made it back to the main trail. The wide, well-marked path that I had left hours ago was now a beacon of safety. My feet carried me faster than I had ever run, and within minutes, I saw the parking lot in the distance. I didn't stop until I was inside my car, the doors locked, the engine running. I drove away, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel. I couldn't explain what had happened. There had been no one else on the trail, no one that I had seen, no sign of any person or animal. But the feeling, the presence of something was real, and I wasn't going back to those woods. Not ever. The morning was still cool as I set out, the air fresh with the scent of damp earth and pine. It had been a while since I'd been on a hike like this, deep into the woods, far from civilization, where you could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot and the soft whisper of wind through the trees. The hike was supposed to be an easy one, just a few miles up the mountain, then back down by afternoon. I needed to clear my head, get away from the noise and pressure of everyday life. It's what I always did when I needed time to think, time to be alone with my thoughts. I had been to this trail before many times and I knew it well. The path was wide at the beginning, well-maintained, and easy to follow. The trees around me were tall and thick, their branches casting shadows across the path. It was the kind of trail that was peaceful but not overly isolated. Enough people came through here that you didn't feel too far from civilization. As I walked, I thought about my life back in the city. The stress, the constant rush. It felt suffocating sometimes, and I thought a few hours in the woods would help. My legs burned a little as I moved up the incline, but that was normal. Hiking was supposed to challenge you even if it was just for a few hours. The sun was rising higher now, and the sky above me had turned a clear blue. The only sounds were my footsteps, the occasional call of a bird, and the rustling of leaves in the trees. It was perfect, exactly what I needed. No distractions, no noise, just the world and me. After a couple of hours, I reached a small clearing with a large rock at the edge of the trail. It was a nice spot to take a break, so I sat down, pulled out a granola bar, and drank from my water bottle. I looked around, appreciating the quiet. The only movement was the occasional squirrel darting from tree to tree, and I could hear the distant sound of a stream running somewhere below me. For a moment, I felt like I could stay here forever, just listening to the sounds of nature and letting the calm settle in. But then, something caught my eye, a flicker of movement. I turned my head sharply, expecting to see an animal, maybe a deer or another hiker, but there was nothing. I told myself I was imagining things. It had been a long day, and I hadn't slept well the night before, but still the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Something felt off. I stood up, dusting off my pants, and took a few steps forward, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. The trail narrowed after the clearing, the trees crowding in closer, the path becoming a little more overgrown. It wasn't much of a challenge, but it was less comforting than the wide, open path I had been walking on earlier. I continued on, the unease lingering but not enough to stop me. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. The farther I went, the less the trail seemed familiar. The trees grew thicker, the underbrush denser. The trail wasn't as well marked now. I had hiked this path before, but it didn't look quite the same. I paused to check my map, wondering if I had taken a wrong turn. The map showed the trail splitting off ahead, but the markers were a little unclear. I wasn't too concerned. After all, I was just going to the top, a place I'd been many times before. Still, there was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind, telling me to turn around, to head back to the clearing and find the main trail again. But I ignored it. I kept walking. As I moved forward, the trees seemed to grow closer, their trunks darker and thicker. The sun had become less intense, the canopy above blocking out the light, and the air had a damp, earthy smell. The trail became more difficult to navigate. Roots stuck up from the ground, and rocks lay scattered along the path, making it easy to trip. I was too focused on watching my footing to notice anything else at first. But when I did finally look up, I saw it. A figure standing motionless just off the trail. It was far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, but I could see the outline clearly enough. Tall, wearing something dark, and standing still as if they had been waiting for me. At first, I assumed it was another hiker, but there was something strange about the way they were standing. They weren't moving, not even to adjust their position. I paused, my heart suddenly racing. The air felt colder now, as if the temperature had dropped in an instant. I wasn't sure why, but the figure made me uneasy. Something about the way they stood there so still made me feel like they weren't supposed to be there. I took a step back, but the figure didn't move. I squinted, trying to make out more details, but they remained just beyond the edge of my vision, too far to be certain. For a moment, I thought about calling out, but the words caught in my throat. I was alone on this trail. There shouldn't be anyone out here this far in. I turned around quickly, deciding to go back to the clearing. My footsteps quickened, though I wasn't sure why. I wasn't running, but I was walking faster than I normally would, my eyes flicking nervously over my shoulder. There was no sign of the figure now, but the unease in my stomach wouldn't fade. It felt like I was being watched, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I didn't stop until I was back at the clearing. I glanced around, half expecting to see the figure again. But there was nothing, just the quiet of the woods. I breathed a sigh of relief, but my heart was still pounding in my chest. What had I seen? Had I imagined it? No, I knew what I had seen. I wasn't sure what it meant, but something wasn't right. I decided to head back down the trail, retracing my steps. The sooner I was back at the parking lot, the better. The thought of being out here alone, surrounded by so much silence, had become unbearable. I had come for solitude, but now all I wanted was the noise and safety of the city. The descent was quicker, but the feeling of being watched never left. The trees seemed to crowd closer, the shadows stretching longer. I kept my pace steady, but the trail felt different now, more sinister. The noise of my footsteps was the only sound that broke the silence, but even that felt wrong, echoing strangely in the stillness. As I neared the parking lot, I felt a small sense of relief. The trees began to thin, and I could see the faint outline of my car up ahead. The woods were receding, and I was almost out, almost free. But then, just before the last stretch of the trail, I stopped dead in my tracks. The figure, it was standing at the edge of the trail, right where it met the clearing. My heart slammed against my chest. There was no mistaking it now. It was the same figure, the same dark shape standing motionless, just watching me. The same cold air seemed to surround me, and I felt the weight of the forest closing in once more. I didn't hesitate this time. I turned and ran, faster than I had ever run before. My breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as I sprinted toward the parking lot, the figure disappearing into the trees behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't want to. I reached my car, fumbled for my keys, and practically threw myself into the driver's seat. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and started the engine. My hands were shaking as I pulled out of the parking lot, my foot pressing down on the gas as I drove away. For a long time, I didn't say anything. I just kept my eyes on the road, the hum of the engine the only sound. As the woods disappeared in the rearview mirror, I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I didn't know who or what that figure was, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never set foot on that trail again. It wasn't supposed to be a difficult hike, just a short, simple day trip, a way to get some fresh air and a break from the noise of city life. The kind of trip I used to take all the time, back before life got too complicated. I had done it 1,000 times, stepping out onto the trail, just me and the woods, nothing but the sound of my boots on the dirt and the birds in the trees. I woke up early, just as the sun was starting to creep over the horizon, casting a faint orange glow on the world. The air was crisp, fresh, full of the earthy scent of pine trees and damp soil. I packed my bag with the essentials: water, some granola bars, my phone, and a map. I didn't need much. I had hiked this trail before 12 times at least. I knew it well. The parking lot at the trailhead was quiet, not a soul in sight. Perfect, I thought. Peaceful day ahead. I locked my car, adjusted my pack, and stepped onto the trail. The path was soft, slightly muddy from the rain the night before. I didn't mind. There was something satisfying about the sound of my boots squelching into the earth. The first part of the trail was easy, wide, well-trodden, and familiar. The kind of trail that doesn't make you work too hard, but still gives you that feeling of being away from everything. I could hear the distant hum of the highway for a while, but soon even that faded. The trees grew denser, the path narrower, and the noise of civilization was gone. I liked that feeling, the stillness. It was peaceful. It was grounding. It reminded me that I was small, just one person in a vast world. The world felt right here, in the woods, away from the distractions of modern life. I kept walking, the trail weaving through tall trees, their branches forming a canopy overhead. The morning sun filtered through the leaves, creating dancing patterns of light and shadow on the ground. I breathed it all in, the air, the silence, the wildness. I felt at home in it. After a couple of hours, I reached a small creek that ran alongside the trail. The sound of the water flowing over rocks was calming. I stopped for a rest, took a long drink from my bottle, and snacked on a granola bar. The creek was shallow here, just a trickle, but it had a peaceful, almost magical quality to it. I dipped my hand into the cool water, feeling the slight sting of coldness against my skin. I had been hiking alone for most of the morning, and I was enjoying the solitude. But that's when I noticed it, the sudden, inexplicable feeling that I wasn't alone. At first, I shrugged it off as my mind playing tricks. But then the feeling grew. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone behind me. There was nothing, just trees, just the sound of the water. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the unease. It was just my imagination. After all, it was a popular trail. People hiked it all the time. There was nothing to be afraid of. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. I continued walking, trying to push the discomfort aside. The trail wound upward now, becoming steeper and more rugged. The trees thinned a little, allowing more sunlight to break through. The air felt warmer here, but the unease still lingered. I passed a few fallen logs, their bark slick with moss. I noticed a strange mark on one of them, a deep scratch running along its length, like something sharp had scraped against it. I bent down to look at it more closely, but then I heard a noise, something behind me, a snap, a twig breaking underfoot. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I turned around quickly, expecting to see someone. A hiker, maybe, just a little ways behind me on the trail. But there was no one, just the trees, the thick underbrush, and the faint sound of the wind. I should have kept walking. I should have told myself it was nothing, but for some reason I couldn't. The silence had become oppressive. The stillness of the woods felt different now, like it was holding something back. I decided to move faster. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the increasing sense of being watched. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to close in around me. But something inside me told me to pick up the pace, so I did. The trail grew more uneven as I climbed higher, the ground soft and spongy beneath my boots. I had to step carefully, avoiding rocks and roots that jutted out at odd angles. The forest around me felt thicker now, more tangled. The sunlight barely reached the ground. I was starting to feel the strain of the hike. My legs were sore from the uphill climb, and my water bottle was almost empty. But I pushed on, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. If I just kept going, I thought, I'd reach the summit soon. The view would make it all worth it. And then I saw it, a figure standing just ahead of me on the trail. At first, I thought it was another hiker, but then I realized something was off. The figure wasn't moving. It was just standing there, completely still, staring straight ahead. I couldn't see their face, but their posture was unnerving. It was stiff, unnatural. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart thudded in my chest. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, trying to figure out the situation. It was so out of place. The trail was supposed to be quiet, isolated, just me and the forest. So why was someone standing there, in the middle of it all, not moving? I wanted to call out, ask if they were okay, but the words caught in my throat. There was something about their presence that felt wrong, like they didn't belong. The figure remained motionless, and for a long moment, I just stood there, staring. It felt like an eternity, though it must have only been a few seconds. Finally, I took a step back, cautiously, not taking my eyes off the figure, and then they moved. The movement was jerky, unnaturally quick, like a puppet with its strings pulled too tightly. It wasn't graceful or fluid. It was almost like the figure had been waiting for me to notice them, like they had been frozen until now. I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't right. Without thinking, I turned and started to run. My legs felt heavy, my breath coming in quick gasps as I pushed myself up the trail. The sound of my own footsteps filled my ears, drowning out everything else. I didn't look back. Couldn't. I just ran, faster than I had ever run on a trail before. The trail seemed endless, twisting and turning, but no matter how fast I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The trees seemed to close in around me, the shadows stretching long and dark, swallowing up the daylight. I kept running, not caring about the rocks I was tripping over or the pain in my legs. All that mattered was putting distance between me and whatever that thing was. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I came to a clearing. The trees opened up, and there it was, the trailhead, the parking lot, the safety of the outside world. I didn't stop. I ran straight to my car, heart pounding in my chest. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my keys, but I finally got the door open. I slammed it shut behind me, locked the doors, and threw the car into gear. I didn't look back, couldn't. As I drove away, the woods seemed to stretch on, endless and empty, like they had been waiting for me. I couldn't explain what had happened out there, what I had seen, or who or what that figure had been. All I knew was that I had been close to something I didn't want to understand. I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew one thing. I would never set foot on that trail again. The woods had changed. Something had changed, and I wasn't going back to figure out what. The morning was crisp, the kind of cool that made your breath fog in the air but didn't quite make you uncomfortable. It was early October, and the leaves were just starting to turn. I had been planning this solo hike for weeks. The trail wasn't long or particularly difficult, but it was remote, away from the usual crowds. The thought of being surrounded by nothing but trees and silence was something I craved. I had always enjoyed hiking. I grew up in a small town where the forest was practically my backyard. My father used to take me on trails like this when I was a kid. There was something about being out there, away from everything, that brought me peace. And I was going to get that peace today. Or at least that was the plan. The parking lot at the trailhead was nearly empty when I arrived. There was one other car parked off to the side, but other than that, nothing. No hikers, no one else around. It was quiet, almost too quiet. But that's what I liked about this place. It felt like it hadn't been touched by civilization. I grabbed my pack, checked that I had everything: water, snacks, a map, a first aid kit, and then locked my car and set off. The trail was a gentle incline at first, surrounded by tall trees, their branches stretching overhead and blocking out the sunlight. The air smelled like fresh pine, and the dirt under my boots felt firm and solid. For the first few miles, the hike was easy. The trail was well marked, and I found myself in a rhythm, breathing in the fresh air, occasionally stopping to drink water or take in the view. I didn't hurry. There was no rush. It felt good to be alone, in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but my thoughts and the occasional chirp of birds. But then, about halfway through, things started to feel off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. It was a small feeling, almost like a shift in the air. I stopped to take a break near a stream. The soft sound of the water rushing over rocks was calming. But even as I sat there, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. I scanned the trees, the rocks, the empty trail behind me. There was no one, just the quiet hum of nature. Still, something about it felt wrong. The quiet had become too still. No birds calling, no rustling of animals in the underbrush. It was like everything had gone silent, holding its breath. I shook it off. It was probably just my imagination. I had hiked in isolated places before, and this was nothing new. But still, I found myself moving a bit faster, picking up the pace, as if trying to escape something that I couldn't quite see. The trail began to narrow, and the trees grew thicker. The once pleasant sounds of the forest now felt oppressive. The further I went, the more isolated I felt. The leaves on the ground were thick, and each step seemed to echo louder than the last. I hadn't seen another soul for over an hour now, and even the distant hum of traffic that I had faintly heard at the start had faded completely. It was just me and the forest. I rounded a bend in the trail, and that's when I saw it. A figure, standing still about 30 feet ahead of me. At first, I thought it was another hiker, but something about the way the figure stood, completely still, unmoving, staring at the ground, sent a chill through me. I couldn't see their face. They were dressed in hiking gear, but their posture was odd, almost unnatural. It was as though they were frozen, not even a breath of movement. I froze too, instinctively. My heart rate quickened, but I didn't want to draw attention. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I say something? Keep walking? But then the figure shifted. It wasn't a normal movement. It was a sharp, jerky motion, like it wasn't quite in sync with the world around it. I took a hesitant step back. The air around me felt thick now. The quiet was so absolute that I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. The figure hadn't noticed me yet, and I considered turning back, retracing my steps, but something made me stay rooted to the spot. I watched them for what felt like a minute, though it couldn't have been that long. My mind was racing, looking for any logical explanation. Maybe they were lost. Maybe they were waiting for someone. But then, just as quickly as it had started, the figure turned around and started walking away. The odd, jerky movements continued, like the person wasn't entirely in control of their body. I wanted to call out to ask if they were okay, but I couldn't. Something about the way they moved made my stomach churn. I waited until they had disappeared out of view before I decided to keep going. But now, everything felt different. The trail no longer felt like a peaceful escape. It felt like an obstacle, a path I had to navigate carefully, not just physically, but mentally. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure again. But there was nothing, just the trees, the rocks, and the distant sound of the wind. The farther I went, the more the forest seemed to close in on me. The trail wasn't as well defined here, the undergrowth thickening, the trees blocking out even more light. I pulled out my map, trying to reassure myself that I was on track. But the more I looked at it, the more I realized something was wrong. The landmarks didn't match up with what I was seeing around me. The trail didn't curve the way it was supposed to, and I couldn't make sense of the lines. I tried to ignore the rising panic. Maybe I had taken a wrong turn. Maybe I was just tired. But deep down, I knew that something wasn't right. Then I heard it. A sound, faint at first but unmistakable. Footsteps, not the rustling of animals, but the steady, deliberate crunch of someone walking through the underbrush. I stopped, listening, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. My heart was pounding now, adrenaline flooding my system. I wasn't alone. I turned around. The forest was empty. No one behind me. The path stretched on ahead, just trees and dirt. But I still couldn't shake the feeling. The footsteps continued, not in any kind of regular pattern, but enough to make my blood run cold. I kept walking, faster now, my breath coming in quick bursts. Every time I looked back, I saw nothing. The trail behind me was clear. The footsteps had stopped. I tried to calm myself, but I couldn't. The deeper I went, the less I felt like I was in control. My sense of direction was slipping away. The map, the compass, they all seemed useless now. It was like I was moving through a maze that kept changing with every step. Hours passed. The sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows over the trail. I didn't know how long I had been hiking or how far I had gone, but the daylight was running out. I wasn't sure where I was anymore. Every direction looked the same. The trail was gone, replaced by thick trees and underbrush. I couldn't find the path. I was lost. And then, finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I saw something. A break in the trees. A small clearing where the sky opened up, and in the distance, I could see the faint outline of a road. A real road, not the trail, but something real and concrete. I wasn't imagining it. I had found it. I stumbled toward it, the relief washing over me like a wave. When I reached the clearing, I could see the road more clearly. A dusty dirt road that led to a small parking lot. I wasn't sure how long it had taken, but the light was almost gone now. The last sliver of daylight was slipping below the horizon. I had made it. As I walked toward the parking lot, I glanced behind me, and for a split second, I thought I saw something moving between the trees. Just a flicker. But when I looked again, there was nothing. Just the quiet woods, bathed in twilight. When I reached my car, I didn't even stop to think. I just got in, slammed the door, and drove off. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't tell if it was from fear or exhaustion. And as I drove, I couldn't shake the thought. The figure in the woods, the footsteps. I tried to make sense of it, but every time I did, the unease grew stronger. I had been lucky. I had made it out, but I would never forget that feeling. The feeling of being watched, of something just beyond the trees, waiting. and I'll never hike that trail again. Not ever. I've been hiking for years, so I'm no stranger to the forest. In fact, I've hiked some of the most rugged, isolated trails across the country. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened last weekend. It was a Saturday morning when I decided to head to the mountains. I had picked a trail that seemed perfect for a solo hike, remote, quiet, and unknown to most hikers. It was the kind of trail that didn't show up on popular maps. I found it after reading some obscure online blog about hidden hiking spots. The post had pictures of a narrow, winding path through dense trees, and in the distance, a scenic view of the valley below. It looked like a perfect day hike, something to recharge from the monotony of everyday life. I could already picture myself standing at the summit, looking out over a view so peaceful that it would reset my mind. I packed my usual gear: a backpack, water, snacks, a small first aid kit, a map, and a compass. I checked my boots and made sure they were tight. Nothing ruins a hike like uncomfortable shoes. The drive there was uneventful, and when I arrived at the trailhead, the lot was almost empty, with only a single car parked by the edge. No one around, just the woods and me. It was perfect. I had the trail to myself. At first, the path was exactly what I had imagined. Narrow and overgrown with tall grass brushing against my legs. The trees were thick, creating a canopy that blocked out the sun, casting everything in soft shadow. It felt cool under the shade, even though the sun was high in the sky. The quiet was almost deafening, with only the occasional rustle of a squirrel or the distant chirp of a bird. I started walking, settling into the rhythm of my steps. The path was a bit rugged, but nothing too bad. There were sections where the earth was loose, and the trail would dip down steeply before climbing again. It wasn't a technical trail, but it demanded some attention. The further I went, the more isolated I felt. At first, the feeling was refreshing. There was no one around, just me and the quiet. The first few miles went by with ease. I came across a small stream that I crossed on a log bridge. I stopped for a while, sitting on a rock and taking in the silence. No one else had been on the trail, and I hadn't seen any signs of wildlife besides the occasional bird and squirrel. It was almost eerie, but in a peaceful way. The kind of quiet where you can hear your own heartbeat. Then, as I walked further, the trail began to change. The trees got thicker, their trunks twisted and knotted, blocking the light even more. The trail became steeper, and soon, I was climbing up rocky slopes, my boots scraping against the rough stone. The silence continued, stretching longer and longer, and I began to notice something strange. It was like the world around me had grown too still. I hadn't seen any other signs of life. No birds, no squirrels, no insects, nothing. It was just me and the woods. I pushed the thought aside, chalking it up to the remoteness of the trail. Maybe the animals stayed away from the deeper, less traveled parts of the forest. Still, the silence was unsettling. It felt unnatural. I looked around, half expecting to see someone watching me from behind a tree, but there was no one. The trail wound around a sharp bend in the mountain, and that's when I saw it. A figure. It was standing in the clearing up ahead. At first, I thought it was another hiker, but then I realized how strange it was. They weren't moving, just standing there, facing away from me, completely still. It was the kind of posture that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't see their face, just the outline of their body, standing tall in the middle of the clearing. I stopped walking, my breath catching in my throat. Could have been nothing. Maybe they were resting, I thought, but something didn't feel right. The figure wasn't moving at all. The longer I stood there, the more the scene seemed off. I took a cautious step forward, my boots crunching against the dried leaves. Still, the figure didn't turn. I called out, but there was no response. I was about to turn away and leave when the wind picked up, and the figure shifted ever so slightly, just enough to let me know it was aware of my presence. My heart began to race. I looked around, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There were no other signs of life, no animals, no birds, nothing. The figure stood motionless in the clearing, the only thing out of place in an otherwise empty forest. I wanted to call out again, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I took another step back, my feet crunching loudly in the quiet. The figure didn't respond. I kept walking, my mind racing. What had I just seen? Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? But the unease wouldn't leave. I felt like I had to keep moving, like something wasn't right. The deeper into the forest I went, the more disoriented I felt. The path twisted and turned, and I realized I had no idea where I was anymore. The landmarks from earlier had disappeared. I couldn't remember how long I had been walking. My pace slowed, and I stopped to check my map. The map was no help. There was a marked trail in front of me, but nothing matched what was on the paper. The curves, the elevation changes, they didn't line up. I looked at the compass. It was working, but I couldn't make sense of where I was. The air felt thick, like the forest was closing in. My heart pounded harder in my chest. I looked back. The clearing where I had seen the figure was far behind me, but the path ahead seemed endless. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. There was no noise, just the occasional distant creak of a tree branch. I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was wrong. I started walking faster, more erratically now. The quiet was maddening. Every step felt like it echoed through the trees, but still, there was no sign of anything or anyone else. The deeper I went into the woods, the worse the feeling became. It was like I had stepped into a place where the world didn't exist anymore, where time had no meaning and everything around me had stopped. At some point, I realized that the trail had completely disappeared. I had been walking through dense underbrush for what felt like hours, and there was no sign of the path I had been following. I stopped again, pulling out my map and compass, trying to get a sense of direction. The compass was spinning wildly now, giving me no indication of where I was. I had no idea how I had gotten so turned around, but I was certain now that I was lost, completely lost. I tried to stay calm, focusing on keeping my breath steady. There was no point in panicking. I knew enough to retrace my steps, but the forest looked the same in every direction. The trees were thick, and there were no clear markers. Nothing to tell me I was going the right way. My stomach twisted. The realization hit me hard. I had wandered too far off course, and there was no way to get back to the trail. I couldn't even see the sun anymore. The thick canopy of trees had completely blocked out the sky. I kept walking, hoping to find some sign of the trail or any way out. The air was cooler now, and I shivered even though I wasn't cold. The silence was unbearable. Every snap of a twig underfoot made my heart skip a beat. It felt like the woods themselves were watching, listening. Hours passed, but I couldn't find a way out. My legs ached, and my water had run out long ago. I had no idea how much time had passed, but it felt like it had been days. I was disoriented, exhausted, and scared. Every direction looked the same, and the trees seemed to press in on me, their branches creaking in the wind. And then, just as I was about to break, I heard it, a sound, a faint rustle followed by something familiar, a road. It was faint at first, like the soft hum of a distant highway. I stumbled toward it, pushing through the underbrush, until I broke through the trees and found myself standing at the edge of a dirt road. Couldn't believe it. I had found my way out. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't even think about it. I just started walking, moving as quickly as I could toward the sound of cars. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached the main road. My heart pounded as I walked alongside the shoulder, looking for any sign of civilization. Eventually, I made it back to the parking lot where my car was. It was still empty, and the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the lot. I felt like I had just emerged from some strange, forgotten world. My body was sore, my mind spinning with confusion. I got in the car and drove home, my mind racing with questions. What had happened? How had I gotten so lost? What was that figure in the woods? But no answers came. The only thing I knew for sure was that I would never hike that trail again. And I don't think I'll ever forget the feeling of being watched.